Let's go ahead. Okay, good morning to you all. I hope the technology will save us today. Thank you very much for this invitation. Very sorry that I couldn't be present, but I hope that I can take you through an overview of what is happening to biodiversity in Europe today. And I hope as well that the slideshow will be up for you to get some visuals of some important trends in Europe. So as we all know, and I'm sure the Minister talked about it, Nagoya is taking place now at the European level, at the world level, Europe being very present to try to really help this objective of 2010, i.e. bringing biodiversity in the making of many sectoral policies. Next slide, please. We have been running in Europe for this purpose, for the first time ever, a very important survey of biodiversity situation, which we call a baseline. And this baseline is very much taking into account what has been done in the context of the EU legislation since '79 with the Birds Directive and '92 with the Habitat Directive, and since, of course, the implementation of the Natura 2000 network. But the thing is that, as we know, there are still plenty of things to do, and even the Natura 2000 network won't be enough if we have to achieve, indeed, maintaining biodiversity and in particular realizing green infrastructure. Next slide, please. So we are very much here in the business of understanding what is happening to Europe, but also recognizing the fact that Europe, comparatively, is pretty biodiversity poor compared to the rest of the world, where, for instance, we have close to 500 groups of birds and species in Europe. There are more than 10,000 in the world. And the issue is that we are more and more dependent on natural resources and services outside Europe, just because we consume in Europe twice what we can produce. And all of that, in order to sustain our consumption and production, is very much coming from other countries' environments, and in particular important biodiversity-rich environments. Next slide. At the same time, we need to recognize that Europe, whilst looking at its main terrestrial and marine parts, have also an important role to play internationally if we would consider the overseas territories, which account for a huge amount of natural resources. So 10 to 15% of the coral reefs and lagoons in the world are under the jurisdiction of some of the EU countries. I can also say that, for instance, the French Guiana rainforest is equal the size of Portugal. So we have indeed direct responsibilities. Next slide, please. Now let's go into indeed what we know about biodiversity status in Europe. And an exercise was run in the past 3 years, the very first exercise of this kind in Europe, but also in the world, where, thanks to thousands of reports from countries under Article 17 of the Habitat Directive, we have been gathering information about the conservation status of most of our species and habitats in Europe. The point is, as you can see on this slide, is that unfortunately only 17% of species and habitats are in favorable status in Europe. This is striking. At the same time, we have to recognize that our information basis is still very limited. Just, you have to appreciate that 31% of species and habitats are still unknown to us in terms of their conditions and conservation status. And in particular, when it comes to the marine habitats and species, for which, for instance, we don't know for 59% of the species what is the exact status. So as you can see, there is indeed a trend which is far from helping us achieving the target for 2010, and we have known for years that we won't be able to achieve this objective of halting the loss of biodiversity in Europe. We are, unfortunately again, on a complete opposite path. At the same time, there are huge differences in situations regarding the biogeographic regions. But, for instance, for the Atlantic biogeographic regions, to which Portugal belongs quite a lot, we know that more than 50% of the Atlantic biogeographic regions are under unfavorable status. So this is where we stand when we are talking about the situation. So let's now go through quickly the main reasons why we are in this situation. Next slide. So, first and foremost, there is still a risk of extinction of many species in Europe, up to 25%, in particular for marine mammals, followed by amphibians, and then close to 20% of the terrestrial mammals are also at risk of extinction. 12% of the birds in Europe are really at high risk of extinction, and I'm talking about the IUCN red list categories. So this is something which is alarming if you consider indeed the shares across the different species and habitats groups. Next slide, please. Next to it, and it explains partly this extinction rate, you have the issue of overexploitation, and it is of course very well known and highly illustrated with what's happening in fisheries, where close to 90% of commercial species are overfished. 90% species overfished, which means that close to half of the assessed stocks of fish in European seas are outside safe biological limits, i.e. they cannot regenerate. And overexploitation ends also on some species, in particular for agriculture on land. Next slide. The other issue has to do with the fact that we still have an issue with pollution of soil, of water, and this is leading to 26% of species being threatened by a number of substances and pollutants. At the same time, we still observe in Europe, after 20 years, similar levels of critical loads for eutrophication due to atmospheric deposition across Europe. Next slide, please. Then, today, more and more, we realize that among the 10,000 alien species registered in Europe, they are having a huge effect on species and habitats that we have had for centuries in Europe, meaning that today close to 22% of our species are threatened by these invasive alien species in terms of competition for particular habitats. So range of distribution of some species is shrinking to helping at the end extension of particular species. Yes, next slide. Thank you. So, let's be clear. The overarching threat to our species in Europe and what's happening to large ecosystems is explained by more than 2/3 of it by the loss of habitats. And this is not something which is just regionalized or localized here and there in Europe. This is a threat that we have observed in and across European territories. And I will come back to it in a few minutes. Next slide, please. So, whilst we can indeed congratulate ourselves with a huge achievement in terms of implementing Natura 2000, today 18% of European territories are designated under Natura 2000. It's a huge achievement compared to where we were 20 years ago. At the same time, as I just explained, it is not having the expected effect on the status of biodiversity. And I gave some explanations about why we are in this situation, which I'm going to come back to in